We have now seen the report by Dame Christine Gilbert, the independent review into Ofsted that was commissioned after Ruth Perry's death, and she has found that Ofsted's response to that suicide was defensive and complacent, and the education watchdog is now announcing a series of reforms. So we heard about the scrappy of the one-word ratings yesterday, but there's a number of others as well. So we'll speak to the co-founder of Teacher Tapp about that shortly. We're also going to speak to Ruth Perry's sister, Julia Waters, and Ofsted's Chief Inspector, Martyn Oliver, before 9 o'clock. A major review has found Ofsted's response to a head teacher's suicide following a school inspection was defensive and complacent. Dame Christine Gilbert's independent review was commissioned after an inquest last year concluded that a critical Ofsted inspection contributed to Ruth Perry's death. Now the Education Watchdog has announced a series of reforms following widespread criticism of its inspection practices, including scrapping one-word ratings. Here's Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson.
I've been clear for some time about the need for wider reform of Ofsted. The measures that I've set out in terms of moving away from those one-word judgments within schools are only part of the change that we need to see. And I know from the discussions and meetings that I've had with the new Chief Inspector that he is determined to drive forward the change that Ofsted needs to make sure we have more transparency and openness where it comes to Ofsted's engagement with the profession overall.
So let's talk a bit more about this with the co-founder of Teacher Tapp, Laura McInerney. Morning, Laura.
Good morning.
Can we start with a big picture? Because this is a big report. What are the kind of headline findings, would you say?
So there's needed to be change. Ever since the death of Ruth Perry, there has been this concerted campaign about the fact that Ofsted inspections do put a lot of pressure on school leaders. That doesn't mean that people want to get rid of inspection altogether. And so what the Big Listen did was they went away for many, many months, spoke with teachers, parents, the children themselves to find out how Ofsted can reset its relationship with the whole community and try and bring the stress down. And as you say, this is a very big set of reports out today, which have got some very specific recommendations as what will happen next.
Before we get to the recommendations, what does this review say that Ofsted got wrong and have been getting wrong?
I think there's a view from Christine Gilbert, who was formerly a chief inspector, who went back and looked at the reaction after the death of Ruth Perry. And her view is that the way that occurred was, I think in her words, complacent and defensive. There was a shift, I think, when the inquest actually happened. The coroner's report came out and stated that Ofsted were a part of what had happened. Before that, there was a real reluctance, I think, from the inspectorate to say very much at all because they wanted that evidence. Once that came in, they then shifted into gear.
And in terms of what's being proposed, we spoke yesterday about the one-word grading being scrapped. There's a few recommendations. This one about delaying the publication of certain types of report, I think, is interesting.
Yes, so in the particular case of Ruth Perry, what had happened is the school had previously been outstanding. It was found to be good on many, many levels, but there was an issue around safeguarding. So some of the record keeping around the young people themselves. What Ofsted are now saying is if that's found to be the case again, what they will do is stop the inspection where they feel the leader has the ability to continue and solve those problems. They will pause it, they will come back 3 months later, and then they will carry on with the inspection. However, they will send a letter home to parents in the meantime to let them know what's happening, and in doing so, try to ratchet that pressure down.
Right, understood. And there's a thing about the sort of the what these new gradings might look like, these kind of report cards. Can you describe it for us?
Sure. So at the moment, an Ofsted report does look at a range of different areas in a school and give a grade for that, which runs from inadequate to outstanding. But then overall, there was one word put at the top of the inspection. And if that is inadequate, it can often feel incredibly personal for the leaders who then carry that one word around, even when other parts of the school might be good. And so what's happened yesterday is the government came out and said immediately that will go. So you will still have the 4 words, but you won't have the one word judgment. And over the next 12 months, Ofsted will now work towards what's going to be called a balanced scorecard. We don't know what it will look like. It will probably be 1 or 2 pages with a range of different information information on it so that parents can make a more nuanced judgment. And one of the things the inspectorate has said as well is they're going to look very carefully at the inclusion of vulnerable children in those schools. So that will be children who are from poorer backgrounds, from special educational needs, because there has been some concern that while schools have got outstanding and they put that on the banners outside, that's because they've been not having as many children turn up or not taking them in and sending them elsewhere if they've found them to be more challenging to meet their needs.
And what about the inspectors themselves and the inspections themselves? Are they looking at how they're conducted and the manner and tone of them?
That's something that Ofsted have been working on already. So there's been a lot more training around the mental health of the leaders who are involved in the inspection. And of course, they have committed to carry on and doing that. And I have to say, we started polling on this yesterday. So we've still got a little way to go before we've got the full sample in. But at the moment, it is such a positive response. I feel fairly confident that it's not going to change as the polling ends. And this is something that, by and large, the teaching community are taking very, very well to.
The thing about the training of the inspectors is I assume that Ofsted have always tried to train their inspectors well anyway.
Yes, I don't think there's ever been an era when Ofsted have said what we're going to do this year is train our inspectors to be worse than they were before.
No.
So, I mean, that is to be taken as read. And look, there are legitimate concerns here. Yesterday, Dr. Mary Bowstead, who was formerly the head of the National Education Union, said she welcomed the steps, but her concern has always been how reliable these grades are. If you send a couple of people into a school for 2 days, can they really tell you what's going on? And her view is, it doesn't matter if it's 4 grades or it's on one piece of paper, or, you know, even if you commit to training your inspectors better, she would question whether or not that is achievable.
Thanks very much for your time this morning. Appreciate it, Laura. And Laura's gone. Co-founder of Teacher Tapp there, Laura McInerney. Before 9 o'clock, we'll speak to Ruth Perry's sister, Julia Waters, and Ofsted's Chief Inspector, Martyn Oliver. 17 minutes past 6. First, though, an independent review has criticised the way Ofsted responded to the death of the head teacher, Ruth Perry, who took her own life after learning that her school was being downgraded by inspectors.
The report says the watchdog made no attempt to contact her family and seemed to assume it had done nothing wrong. Now the education watchdog has announced a series of reforms following widespread criticism, including scrapping one-word ratings. And her sister, Julia Waters, is with us now. Morning, Julia.
Good morning.
Your reaction to this independent review, is it a sense of relief that the family's concerns have been recognised? Does it just fire up the anger over the way that you think your sister was treated?
It explains in quite excruciating detail quite why Ofsted was so tone deaf towards us and why they resisted any criticism, any attempts on our part to share our experiences with them. I mean, yes, you've mentioned how it was just a completely tone deaf response, a completely hurtful response. And to learn that, for instance, Ofsted staff and the board of Ofsted, which is meant to hold Ofsted leaders to account, found out about Ruth's death via the media. So there'd been no internal briefing of that. Just speaks volumes for what a dysfunctional, defensive and complacent organisation it's been for far too long. It's been able to hide behind its independence as an arm's length body of government to exert enormous power, completely unquestioned, for far too long. And frankly, their response to my sister's death is absolutely symptomatic of a much, much, much wider dysfunction within Ofsted. If Martyn Oliver is not able to address Christine Gilbert's concerns urgently, I still fear for the safety of head teachers and teachers being inspected by this organisation.
And just for clarity, this review, the report which we're reading today, is around how Ofsted responded in the aftermath of Ruth's death rather than the original inspection.
Yes, it is. And it actually, in doing that, Ofsted set the terms of reference for this learning review themselves. And those terms of reference are not addressing the questions that and the concerns that the coroner raised in her Prevention of Future Deaths report at the end of the inquest into my sister's death, which were to look at their own internal procedures and the elements of the inspection and the inspection system that had contributed to her death. So I very much welcome the fact that Christine Gilbert has interpreted the terms of reference given to her very broadly to go beyond what Ofsted had asked her to do. And in so doing, she does probe some of the structural and cultural issues in Ofsted that have led to their tone deaf, irresponsible response to her death, and their refusal to acknowledge that the inspection had anything to do with it. But yes, there is still this niggling concern. There are still questions that haven't been answered because Ofsted have refused to go back and look at that inspection itself.
We did hear from the government yesterday that they were getting rid of one-word judgments with immediate effect. And I know you have said you are delighted about that. It's felt that that was a significant cause of distress to Ruth. Is that enough? There are, of course, going to be further reforms to the whole inspection system. But what would you pick out that's important?
No, it's not enough. It's nowhere near enough. But it signals, obviously, the decision to remove single word judgments does stand with the government, though Ofsted could have had a stronger view on that sooner. It's interesting to see that they are now in favour of scrapping single word judgments. So I'm delighted that that's the case. I'm not so reassured by Ofsted's own response to this Big Listen. I mean, the Big Listen survey, despite the many flaws in the way that it was set up and the questions that it asked, has thrown up some highly critical responses for Ofsted. The Christine Gilbert's report is utterly damning of Ofsted, and the responses that Ofsted have offered so far to me, I mean, there is an acknowledgement that there needs to be, Martyn Oliver calls it real change, and they need to build a better Ofsted. He is absolutely acknowledging that things need to change. But the responses, the actual practical responses of what they're going to do to reduce stress and workload actually seem to do the opposite. Without clarity of what they're getting rid of, they seem just to be piling more
on. Well, let's talk about that. Let's look at some of the details. So they say there's going to be a shift in focus to pupil outcomes. They're talking about measures to reduce anxiety for staff at schools around inspection. So, for example, they will be told on a Monday if there's going to be an inspection, so they're not living in a sort of state of anxiety all week. They talk about more focus in inspections on vulnerable, disadvantaged children, but enhanced training for inspectors. So there will be a new Ofsted Academy. Those are just some of the things that I picked out from this report. But what do you feel is missing then?
I mean, no one is going to complain. No one should complain about putting more focus on vulnerable children and children with special educational needs. I absolutely, that's a very laudable aim and needs to be there. The question is, how are they going to do that? I mean, schools are already under enormous pressure with very limited budgets to sort out what are often much broader societal problems that the school actually has limited control over. So that, yes, it's a laudable aim, but what is that going to mean for schools, for head teachers? Is there going to be extra funding and support to enable them to do that? Martyn Oliver says that he wants to take greater account of the context in schools. How are they going to do that? He says he wants to work to reduce pressure and workload, but is at the same time talking about a greater emphasis on data and rigour, which sounds like more work. And I think one of the areas that is still very unclear and potentially will create vastly more stress for head teachers is around the inspection of safeguarding. I know the sector, the unions have been calling for a long time. The parliamentary inquiry called for this. The Beyond Ofsted report called for separating safeguarding from the Ofsted inspection, having separate light touch annual safeguarding checks. But the response from Ofsted seems to be suggesting that Ofsted would carry out these annual checks, and that there would still be a safeguarding element within the inspection. Well, that would just add to the stress.
Although
it's great
that they are going to give this a period of time for schools to address safeguarding concerns before they publish a report.
I mean, they'd already committed to doing that following my sister's death, because clearly that was one of the terrible injustices in Ruth's situation. The school she ran was marvellous, the coroner described it, in every other aspect, except they found some sort of gaps in safeguarding record keeping. No evidence of harm to children, but there were some record keeping issues that could be rectified easily and quickly. So obviously, I mean, it's absolutely obvious that any system that's about improvement needs to give schools a chance to improve. What's good here now is they are saying that now, yes, schools will be given a period of up to 3 months to put any such issues right before the report, before the inspection concludes, before the report is issued. And that's a significant and positive change on what they had promised before. So someone in Ruth's situation would not have to face that public humiliation and shame of a negative inspection result, of an inadequate judgment in her case, without a chance to put things right. So that's good.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of other stuff in here that I don't think has been consulted upon with the sector, and which would add stress and workload to head teachers rather than reduce it. So I think Martyn Oliver needs now to do some work to actually clarify how these things are going to be done and what Ofsted is going to stop doing in order to be able to do all these additional things that he's promising.
Well, I've made notes of everything that you've said, and we are going to be speaking to Martyn Oliver after 8 o'clock this morning, so I will put as many of your points to him as I can. Julia, thanks once again for being with us on 5 Live Breakfast.
Thank you.
I know that each time there is a kind of landmark like this, it's probably really difficult for all the family to have to go back through the trauma of what happened to Ruth, but we appreciate it.
Thank you.
All the best. That's Julia Waters, who's the sister of Ruth Perry, the head teacher who took her own life. And as I mentioned, we'll talk to Martyn Oliver. He's the Chief Inspector of Schools at around about 8:10 this morning. It's 18 minutes past 7. An independent review has criticised the way Ofsted responded to the death of the head teacher Ruth Perry, who took her own life after learning that her school was being downgraded by inspectors. The report says the watchdog made no attempt to contact her family and seemed to assume it had done nothing wrong. Now, the Education Watchdog has announced a series of reforms following widespread criticism, including scrapping one-word judgments. Earlier, we spoke to Ruth Perry's sister, Julia Waters, who gave her reaction to the review.
Frankly, their response to my sister's death is absolutely symptomatic of a much, much, much wider dysfunction within Ofsted. If Martyn Oliver is not able to address Christine Gilbert's concerns urgently, I still fear for the safety of head teachers and teachers being inspected by this organisation.
Well, Martyn Oliver is here in the studio with us now, Chief Inspector for Ofsted. How does it make you feel hearing that?
Well, that's why I commissioned the report. I, as a head teacher myself for nearly 30 years, I know the pressure of inspection. Quite rightly, there's a level of accountability out there on school leaders, and not just schools, because Ofsted doesn't inspect just schools. We inspect childminders, colleges, in fact, 92,000 providers across the country. But that needs to be done in a proportionate way. We know our work is valued, but we know we can do better. So we're resetting relationships, and we can improve. And in fact, Christine Gilbert, in her review, and I'm very grateful for it, that Professor Waters just referenced, she does recognise that Ofsted has made changes before me and since I took over in January, and that things have improved greatly.
But dysfunction, says Julia Waters, still lies at the heart of the organisation. And it's clear from what this review says that you did not do enough in light of Ruth Perry's death.
Well, I wasn't in charge back then. Still talking about Ofsted, which I'm now in charge of since January, we have done a tremendous amount. There was a tremendous amount done by my predecessor, who was the longest-serving chief inspector in Ofsted, and then since January we've made further reform and further changes.
Why didn't Ofsted approach Ruth Perry's family after she died?
I don't know. I wasn't there, so I can't answer.
Have you apologised to Ruth Perry's family?
I did, immediately on taking office. Actually, the first person that I met when I started in January. Remember, this is nearly 2 years ago, and I started in January. And my first action was to meet with Professor Waters, and then it was to commission this review, not just the Big Listen, which is the largest in Ofsted's history. It's got independent research, and it's got Dame Christine Gilbert's independent review that you're referring to.
So you carried out this big survey called the Big Listen, getting responses from loads of people involved in education, including staff and parents and so on. And what you learn from that is that up and down the country, senior leadership teams absolutely dread the phone call telling them Ofsted will be coming to call. Is that the kind of environment that you want your inspectors to create?
No, and I was one of those head teachers. So you don't want a dreading environment, but you do recognise as a head teacher that you are accountable. You're given, in many cases, millions of taxpayers' pounds to give the best education and care to children. You expect accountability. It just needs to be proportionate, and that's why the reforms that I set out in response to the Big Listen will deliver those.
Right. Tell us how, specifically.
So reducing the pressure and resetting the relationship, well, some of that's to do with culture and consistency, focusing on the most vulnerable children out there, specifically children with special educational needs. I'm really proud that one part of the Big Listen was a survey of children themselves, and more than 4,000 of them responded. And really hearteningly, they said that they want Ofsted to check how happy, healthy and safe they are.
And that's good and important. But if you're asking schools and Ofsted to be doing that as well, that's only going to add to the pressure, to the workload for teachers. Well, so how are you reducing it in other areas so that they can refocus in those that you've described there?
So that's the day job of teachers, and making sure that Ofsted's focusing on the right things that matter to parents and children is also what matters to teachers. How we're reducing pressure? Well, there are numerous ways. One is to make sure that we announce school inspections as a pilot on Mondays. That means that head teachers right now, they don't know when they're in the window of an Ofsted inspection. Sometimes, I can remember head teachers used to work for me. They'd put the suit in their car, they'd carry it with them for months, just in case there was a call. But I can now say that by a Monday afternoon, the school will know if we're going to inspect them that week. And then that means that head teachers will know the pressure will reduce for them, and they won't have to think about being constantly in that window. And it also means that our inspectors will be able to train more, far more than they've ever done. Far better consistency.
Do you acknowledge that, consistency is very important here, because that's another thing that the review has found, inconsistency amongst the inspections. So the standard of inspections has not been good enough up until this point. Do you acknowledge that?
Not universally, no. I've got very hard-working, diligent experts.
Sure, but if it's inconsistent, how does that help parents, teachers judge a school?
Well, this is really interesting because people talk about inconsistency. I heard a really respected teacher who said, I'm really fearful of Ofsted coming. I don't know what the inspection will be like. They had their inspection. They then said it was a great experience. It was really supportive. But, that's because I got the right inspector. Well, they don't know that. That's just subjective.
Well, we do know that because you're hearing from loads of teachers and head teachers who are saying that is not their experience.
Yeah, and we also know that we do tens of thousands of inspections a year, tens of thousands. And these inspections on the whole go often without any issues whatsoever. But where we get it wrong, That's not good enough, and it sends a shockwave of pressure.
Well, you're setting up
through
a
the
whole new Ofsted Academy, which would seem to suggest that you do acknowledge that the standard of inspection hasn't been good enough till now.
Well, I acknowledge all of it because I commissioned all of these reviews in order to help me build a better future. And in the last 8 months, I've been working flat out, and then with the old government, and then again with the new government. And just yesterday, the Secretary of State announced the removal of the overall effectiveness grades as just yet another signal of how Ofsted is reforming.
You didn't want to do that, did you? Are you happy with it now?
Yes, I'm very happy with it. In fact, the Secretary of State commissioned the advice from me. I was happy to give it to her. She then took the decision.
You've also said you're going to take into account context for schools. How? What does that mean exactly?
Well, the really important thing is what's it like to be a child? I think parents have told me really clearly they want to know not just what it's like for their child in their setting, whether it's the early years or a primary or a secondary or a college, but they want to know what it's like in the whole there as their child moves from birth right through to adulthood. So we're going to use all of the power and the uniqueness of Ofsted's inspection across the 92,000 providers to give better information to parents, use better data, and make sure that that will help us then be more consistent
and more useful. As a parent, I don't understand what you're saying. So what am I going to see or read?
So you'll see something called area insights, and we talk about this in the response. So we'll be able to say as a new parent, where are the early years providers around you, how close they are to where you live. You'll then see the quality of all the primaries and the secondaries and the further education colleges around you. You'll get better information in a new report card, far more nuanced information in a new report card style framework, which will tell you, for example, if your child happened to have special educational needs, what's it like to be a child with special educational needs who lives in this area? And all of that context will come into play when we make our decisions about the quality of education and care out there.
Is it going to make things more difficult for parents, do you think, without these single word judgments now? I know that people have said that there is no kind of nuance or detail in single word judgments, but they were an easy tool for parents to compare potential options in their area.
Yeah, easy and simple has been the mantra of single word judgments for an awful long time. And we've known for an awful long time that providers, head teachers, those running settings, didn't like them. They lacked the nuance. But what the big listen tells us is that parents on the whole don't like them too. Okay. And that was a surprise to me. I didn't think that parents would be so clear that they don't like the single word judgment. They do want more nuance. They want better information. And they also want us to take more account of what they think and children think themselves on an inspection. And that's who Ofsted's here for parents and for children.
One other point that Julia Walters raised when she was talking to us earlier was around safeguarding, which she thinks should be dealt with completely separately. So she says that there's a recommendation that there should be a light touch annual safeguarding check on every school. But you're remaining in charge of this and it's still going to be part of the inspection proper. Why is that not being isolated as something quite different?
Well, I've not had a chance yet because the government is still relatively new, but the Secretary of State did set out in the manifesto that they would look at annual safeguarding, annual attendance and annual off-rolling checks. And I'm looking forward to working with the Secretary of State to understand her thinking on that. But in the meantime, let's just be clear. Safeguarding is the responsibility of every single professional in a setting, and that comes down to how well they're led and how well they're managed. Leaders and managers must be in control of safeguarding in schools. It's a very serious aspect of our inspection, and I will never shirk from that duty of making sure that children are safe and well cared for wherever they are.
Can I read you one text? And there are lots coming through on this. I'm glad you're holding Ofsted to account. As someone running provisions within children's social care, it is, says this person, the most ineffective, subjective organisation you could ever come across. No accountability, no real understanding of what is important. I didn't bother with the big listen, and I can assure you they don't. I dread that call every day, despite many positive outcomes.
Well, it's interesting because, and that's disappointing to hear because the big listen, and they will now see if they look at it, was not just only a genuine survey and response, but we've been really transparent and really open in the way we work. And one of the things you'll notice in there, that social care gets the greatest level of support. Of all the areas of trust, people in our social care settings have a great deal of trust in Ofsted and really value our work. That's coming through loud and clear in the survey.
Well, of those who chose to take part, because it's self-selecting. So there may be people who weren't entirely of that view. Let me read you another here. I was chair of governors across 2 inspections. One, a lovely lead inspector who coached and guided leadership throughout. The second, a cold inspector who created a tsunami of stress and badly managed the inspection. Got a good rating in the first, special measures in the second, resulting in a panic attack for our head teacher as the inspector changed our final judgment 3 times in half an hour. We complained to Ofsted, thought about going to the High Court. We had local authority support, but it all meant nothing. We were academised. 2 years later, the school got good again. I firmly believe the lead inspector's personality and character traits are central to the experience and outcome. Someone who wants to remain anonymous so as not to reopen a horrible experience for the school leaders at the time. And that once again speaks to the idea of inconsistency around the way that inspections are led.
Well, no, I don't, respectfully, no, I don't think it does. Let's just be clear.
How doesn't it?
Well, because I can't talk about an individual inspection, especially one that I don't know where it's happened. But of course,
Are you saying that person isn't giving an honest account of what they went through?
Well, let's just take a look at what you just said. So the first inspection was good and the second inspection led to special measures. So clearly that's a difficult judgment for anyone to hear.
It's not quite that straightforward. A second inspector, a cold inspector who created a tsunami of stress and badly managed the inspection.
Yeah, so that bit I don't obviously like to hear. But the final outcome, which you can't divorce from the way the inspection happened, was that school was providing an unacceptable standard of education.
Okay.
And as a result of that, intervention happened, and those children who only get one chance at childhood had a better education and better care. And that's what matters to parents.
Feels like there's still a long way to go on this.
Well, this is the great start today. It's an exciting day. It's very unusual for a government department to take this level of transparency and level of criticism and accept it and build a brighter future. And that's what I'm doing.
Well, we'll revisit again. Thank you for coming in and talking to us and for addressing some of those issues there. Martyn Oliver, who's the Chief Inspector for Ofsted. 8:26.